Drive Record 105. Location: Knox County. Winter conditions on. An evacuation order was issued. Residents were instructed to leave immediately. This footage suggests the evacuation was never completed. Most civilians did not leave. Personal belongings remain. No signs of organized departure. Weather conditions deteriorated faster than expected. Time ran out. Walking through an abandoned fire station, looting a police armory, scavenging medical supplies from a hospital, these actions carry weight beyond simple resource gathering. They represent inheriting the ruins of civilization's attempts to prepare for disaster, taking what was meant for collective protection and using it for individual survival, salvaging value from failed systems. The infrastructure was meant to save people through coordinated official action. Instead, it serves people through uncoordinated individual scavenging, each survivor alone against the world, using tools designed for community protection to protect only themselves. This transformation reveals a deeper truth about disaster planning. Infrastructure matters less than will and capacity to use it. The Knox exclusion zone had excellent infrastructure: fire stations, hospitals, police facilities, stockpiles, communication systems. What it lacked was functional institutions to operate that infrastructure during catastrophe. Authorities willing to stay and serve rather than flee and abandon. Systems robust enough to maintain operation when stressed beyond design parameters. The buildings remain. Monuments to planning that proved inadequate, preparation that missed the crucial variable of human failure under pressure. The people who waited beyond the official infrastructure, the roads marked for evacuation, and the checkpoints that never processed anyone to safety. There exist thousands of smaller stories preserved in abandoned homes, stories of individuals and families who waited for rescue that never came, who prepared for evacuation that never occurred, who maintained hope until hope became delusion and delusion became death. These stories are written in environmental detail, in the placement of objects, and the condition of rooms, in the archaeology of interrupted lives that Project Zomboid's designers scattered throughout Knox Country with remarkable attention to detail and emotional weight. Every house tells a story if you take time to read it. And the most common story is one of waiting, of people who believed official promises, who trusted that authorities had plans and capability to execute those plans, who assumed that in extremis the government would protect its citizens rather than abandon them. Consider a typical middle-class home in Muldraw's residential neighborhoods. You approach cautiously, weapon ready, checking windows for movement. The front door is unlocked, a detail that might mean hasty departure, or might mean the occupants never left, are still inside in some form. You enter, stepping over mail that accumulated after delivery stopped, into a living room that appears superficially normal until you notice the details that reveal desperation. On the coffee table sits a handwritten checklist, items crossed off in neat handwriting that grows increasingly hasty down the page. Important documents, birth certificates, insurance papers, deed, check. Photo albums, check. Medications, check. 3 days of food and water per person, check. Warm clothes, check. Flashlights and batteries, check. Cash, check. The list continues. A careful inventory of what the family planned to take when evacuation buses arrived. Each item ticked off represents effort, forethought, preparation for a journey they never took. Near the front door, arranged for quick grabbing, sit 3 suitcases and 2 backpacks. Opening them reveals the same careful preparation. Clothing folded neatly, rationed to provide several changes while minimizing weight. Family photos in waterproof bags, a child's stuffed animal, carefully packed despite being impractical, maintained because comfort matters even in evacuation. Prescription bottles with labels showing all family members' names, a small jewelry box containing items of sentimental rather than monetary value, a wedding ring set, a locket with photos, a military medal from a grandparent's service. The kitchen tells a different story. The refrigerator stands empty, its contents disposed of preemptively under the assumption that they'd be leaving soon and perishables would rot if left. Cupboards similarly show evidence of deliberate packing. The non-perishables are gone, taken in those suitcases or consumed during the waiting, while items of questionable value remain. Expired cans of vegetables, specialty ingredients for recipes no one would cook during evacuation, alcohol, and condiments. What's left is what people decided they could do without, which reveals what they valued most. Upstairs, the bedrooms preserve evidence of the family composition. A master bedroom with clothing sized for adults, reading material suggesting middle-age interests and concerns. A teenager's room with band posters and school books that would have been needed when classes resumed after the emergency passed. A child's room with toys arranged on shelves. A bed made neatly despite the chaos outside, everything maintained as if normalcy could be preserved through domestic order. And sometimes you find them, the family that waited. Coras in beds, suggesting they died in their sleep when the airborne strain hit, or zombies trapped in rooms, evidence that they turned and family members locked them in, unable to kill them but unwilling to abandon them, maintaining some horrible vigil until they too succumbed. Or simply empty rooms that might mean they finally evacuated on their own initiative, might mean they were killed and dragged away, might mean anything except what they hoped for when they packed those careful suitcases. The calendar hanging in the kitchen has dates circled: July 9th, July 12th, July 15th, notations like evacuation schedule and check radio for updates in hopeful handwriting. Later dates have increasingly desperate notes. Still waiting? Where are they? No buses today again. The final entry reads simply, Day 9, last can of soup. Kids scared, keep hearing gunfire. After that, blank pages stretching into an August that never came for this family. Different homes show different reactions to the dawning realization that evacuation wasn't coming. Some show evidence of defensive measures implemented midway through the crisis. Furniture pushed against doors, windows boarded with materials scavenged from elsewhere in the house, weapons improvised from kitchen knives and sporting equipment. These families pivoted from waiting for rescue to defending ourselves, made the psychological transition from passive to active survival mode. The transition's timing varied. Some houses show extensive fortification alongside packed evacuation bags, suggesting the occupants prepared for both scenarios simultaneously, unable to fully commit to either plan. Others have the bags dumped out, contents scattered, as if the family angrily abandoned evacuation preparation and redirected that energy into fortification. The emotional progression is readable in the physical evidence, open to doubt, into anger, into desperate defensive action. Other homes show no defensive measures, no evolution beyond initial evacuation preparation. These families apparently waited to the end, maintained belief that rescue would come, never accepted that they were alone. Whether this represented faith, denial, or simple inability to imagine alternatives, the result was the same. They died waiting, passive until the end, victims of misplaced trust in systems that had already abandoned them. The class dimensions of this waiting period deserve attention. Wealthier homes in Riverside and West Point's nicer neighborhoods show more extensive evacuation preparation, professionally prepared bug-out bags, expensive camping equipment meant for recreational use now repurposed for survival, generators and fuel stockpiles suggesting ability to maintain some comforts during crisis. These families had resources to prepare comprehensively, and evidence suggests they used those resources to create elaborate evacuation kits that were never needed. But wealth couldn't buy actual evacuation. The buses never came to rich neighborhoods any more than to poor ones. The helicopters never landed in suburban cul-de-sacs, despite ample space for them. Money bought better preparation for a scenario that never materialized, while doing nothing to provide actual escape from the exclusion zone. The expensive bug-out bags sit abandoned in McMansions just like cheap duffel bags sit in working-class homes, equal testaments to evacuation's failure. Working-class homes show different preparation patterns. Less extensive supplies, less expensive equipment, but often more practical knowledge. Evidence of food preservation through canning and pickling, skills that rich families never learned because they could buy preserved food rather than making it. Toolboxes with well-used implements, suggesting comfort with repair and improvisation. Gardens and backyards showing attention to food production. These families had less material wealth, but potentially more relevant survival skills. Those skills alone couldn't save them when infection struck. Trailer parks present the most heartbreaking evidence. These communities housed people with minimal resources, living paycheck to paycheck even before the crisis. Mobile homes show almost no evacuation preparation. No carefully packed bags, no stockpiles of supplies, often barely enough food for normal daily existence, much less emergency preparation. These families weren't waiting for buses because they probably never believed buses would come for them, recognized from experience that official assistance rarely reached the working poor, knew they were always on their own. But trailer parks also show the strongest evidence of community mutual aid, shared supplies distributed across multiple homes, defensive positions established collaboratively, multiple trailers fortified in ways that created defensible zones rather than individual holdouts. Evidence of collective rather than individualistic survival strategies, people pooling resources and protecting each other because they understood official help wouldn't arrive. Churches throughout Knox County preserve particularly poignant evidence of communities gathering during crisis, sanctuaries with sleeping bags spread across pews, evidence that people sheltered in these buildings seeking both physical protection and spiritual comfort, kitchens with signs of mass food preparation, congregations sharing whatever supplies individuals brought, children's artwork decorating walls, crayon drawings of families and houses, and sunshine alongside darker images of the things that waited outside. The churches became gathering points specifically because official evacuation centers never materialized. Radio broadcasts might have mentioned assembly points, but no infrastructure appeared to receive assemblies. No officials arrived to coordinate or protect or transport people to safety. So communities defaulted to existing gathering places, churches, schools, community centers, spaces designed for collective activity now repurposed for collective survival attempt. These informal shelters show patterns of breakdown. Initially organized, sleeping areas designated, food distributed equitably, watch schedules maintained to monitor for threats. Then, gradual deterioration as supplies depleted, as arguments erupted over resource allocation, as fear overwhelmed social cohesion. Finally, chaos, evidence of violence between survivors, bodies of people killed by other humans rather than zombies, the dissolution of community into competing individuals willing to hurt each other over cans of food. Schools show similar patterns at larger scale. Gymnasiums converted into mass sleeping areas, cafeterias used to distribute food, classrooms designated for family groups. initial organization giving way to breakdown as the scale of the disaster became clear and promised rescue failed to materialize. The schools were logical gathering points, large public buildings with extensive facilities designed to accommodate crowds, but they had no defensive infrastructure, no weapons, no supplies beyond minimal first aid kits and cafeteria food meant for normal operations. The children's perspectives preserved in schools create particular emotional weight. Classrooms show abandoned schoolwork, essays about summer vacation plans and future career goals, artwork depicting normal life that ended in early July. One classroom has a wall of self-portraits, every student's face carefully drawn and labeled, now serving as memorial to children who almost certainly didn't survive. The teacher's desk has a journal with entries describing attempts to keep children calm, to maintain routines and lessons despite the horror outside, efforts to preserve childhood normalcy until the very end. Personal journals scattered throughout Knox County provide direct testimony to the waiting experience. These handwritten accounts document the psychological progression from hope to despair, offering intimate perspectives on how individuals processed the evacuation that never came. A teenager's diary describes excitement about potential relocation, viewing evacuation as adventure, an opportunity to see new places and have experiences to tell friends about later. Innocent optimism that later entries reveal transforming into terror as the situation deteriorated. An elderly woman's journal meticulously documents radio broadcasts, recording promised evacuation schedules that kept being postponed, official explanations that became increasingly vague, the gradual realization that authorities were lying or had lost control. Her handwriting remains steady through most entries, suggesting discipline and composure, but final entries show deterioration, shaky letters, incomplete words, increasing spacing, as if writing became physically difficult. The last entry reads, "The broadcasts have stopped. I think that means we're alone now. I'm not afraid. I've lived a full life. But I'm sad for the young ones, for all they'll miss." A father's journal addressed to children who might someday read it explains decisions and actions, attempting to create record and meaning from chaos. He describes initial faith in official evacuation promises, the daily check of radio for schedules, the careful preparation of supplies, then the shift to doubt, day 6 and still no buses, starting to wonder if they're actually coming or if this is like those FEMA trailers that never showed up after the floods. Then acceptance? Day 12. I think we're on our own. I'm going to stop waiting and start really preparing. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it, but maybe the supplies I'm gathering will help you survive. Some journals end mid-sentence. Pens dropped when infection struck or danger arrived. Final entries forever incomplete. Others have deliberate closings, people recognizing their impending death and choosing to leave final messages. These closing entries show remarkable range of human response, some angry, raging against abandonment and injustice, some philosophical, accepting death as inevitable, some focused entirely on others, leaving instructions and love messages for family who might survive. The most haunting homes are those showing evidence of long waiting followed by sudden departure. Everything remains in place. The packed bags, the stocked supplies, the carefully prepared evacuation kit. But the people are gone, vanished, without taking what they so carefully assembled. This suggests either forced evacuation with no time to gather belongings, or death/transformation while away from home, or, perhaps most hopefully, eventual decision to flee without bothering with supplies they'd accumulated for official evacuation that never came. Photo albums provide another layer of testimony. Families selected which photos to preserve during evacuation. Candid shots removed from frames, formal portraits left behind, decisions about which memories mattered most, made in terrible circumstances. Looking through these albums reveals life before. Weddings, births, vacations, graduations, holidays, all the moments people photographed to prove they existed and were happy. The albums often stop mid-93, final photos from early July, showing families who didn't know they were photographing their last happy moments. The waiting period created a specific psychological trap. Each day without evacuation made staying more dangerous. Resources depleted, zombies accumulated, opportunities for independent escape narrowed. But each day without evacuation also increased investment in waiting. We've waited this long. Surely rescue comes tomorrow. If we leave now, we might miss the buses we've been waiting for. This sunk cost fallacy kept people in place, transformed rational calculation into irrational persistence, turned patience from virtue into death sentence. Some families clearly recognized this trap and escaped it. Homes showing abandoned evacuation preparations alongside missing vehicles, especially larger vehicles that could carry people and supplies. These families made the psychologically difficult decision to stop waiting, to accept that official rescue wouldn't come, to take individual action despite uncertainty. Where they went, whether they survived, these questions remain unanswered, but at least they tried, acted, rather than passively accepting fate. The people who waited represent the majority experience inside the Knox exclusion zone. Ordinary individuals who believed official promises because why wouldn't they believe their government? Who prepared carefully for evacuation because preparation seemed prudent? Who maintained hope longer than evidence justified because hope felt better than despair? Their abandoned homes throughout Knox County serve as monuments not to foolishness, but to trust betrayed, to reasonable expectations disappointed by extraordinary circumstances and institutional failure. Walking through these homes, reading their stories in environmental details and scattered writings, creates specific melancholy. These were real people in the game's fiction, individuals with histories and hopes, families with futures they were trying to protect, children who should have lived decades more. The evacuation that never came killed them not through its absence, but through the false promise of its eventual arrival, through the hope that kept them waiting when action might have saved them, through the trust that authorities would fulfill responsibilities they had neither capacity nor ultimately intention to fulfill. Survival in the absence of rescue. When the realization finally settled that no evacuation would occur, that no buses would arrive, that no officials would coordinate rescue, survivors faced a fundamental psychological and practical pivot, from waiting to acting, from hope in external salvation to reliance on internal resources, from passive to active survival mode. This transition defines the core Project Zomboid experience and mirrors the actual psychological journey players undergo as they learn the game's systems and philosophy. The shift manifests first in resource strategy. When evacuation seems imminent, resource gathering serves short-term need. Enough food and water to last until buses arrive, enough supplies to wait comfortably for rescue. But once evacuation is recognized as fiction, resource strategy must change completely. Now you're gathering for indefinite survival, stockpiling not for days but for months or years, thinking about sustainability and depletion rates rather than temporary sufficiency. This changes what matters. Canned goods become crucial. They last effectively forever, provide reliable calories, require minimal preparation. Fresh food becomes risky. It will rot, attracts flies and disease, wastes precious refrigeration capacity once power fails. Water storage transforms from convenience to necessity. You need enough containers to maintain supply if collection methods fail. Enough reserves to survive dry periods or winter freezes. The farming mechanics embody this psychological transition perfectly. Farming makes no sense if evacuation is coming soon. Why spend weeks nurturing crops you won't be around to harvest? But once you accept long-term presence, farming becomes crucial survival strategy. Seeds transform from curiosity to treasure, gardening from hobby to necessity, harvest seasons from abstract agricultural concepts to life or death timing questions. Players typically discover this transition through experience. Early runs often ignore farming, focusing on scavenging and immediate survival. But as characters survive longer, as the finite nature of lootable resources becomes apparent, farming emerges as non-optional. You establish gardens, wait patiently for growth, harvest carefully, save seeds for next season. The rhythm aligns with pre-industrial human existence. Planting in spring, tending through summer, harvesting in autumn, storing for winter. The psychology of farming in the apocalypse carries special weight. It's an act of faith in your own survival, a commitment to being present months from now when harvest comes. Planting seeds when zombies shamble outside your walls represents defiant optimism, betting on life continuing long enough for tiny plants to mature into food. Every successful harvest proves that bet correct, validates the decision to plan for future, rather than merely surviving present. But farming also reveals the harsh mathematics of self-sufficiency. How many crops do you need to survive winter? How much land must be cultivated? What's the calorie yield per square meter of garden space? These questions have concrete answers that can be calculated, and calculating them reveals uncomfortable truths. Self-sufficiency requires extensive cultivation, significant time investment, and luck with weather and growing conditions. One bad season, one mistake in harvest timing, one zombie incursion that tramples your crops, any of these can mean death by starvation months later. Base building follows similar psychological progression. Early bases are temporary. Any reasonably secure house will do. Stay until local resources deplete, then move on. But permanent survival requires permanent base, location chosen carefully, and fortified extensively. The best bases have specific characteristics: proximity to water sources, farmable land nearby, defensive sightlines, multiple entry/exit points for escape, distance from high zombie populations but access to lootable areas. Establishing a permanent base involves significant labor investment. Walls must be constructed using carpentry skills and gathered materials. Windows boarded to prevent zombie entry while maintaining some visibility. Furniture arranged to create defined spaces. Kitchen, storage, sleeping area, workshop. Stockpiles organized systematically so you can find what you need when you need it. Defenses tested and improved iteratively as you discover vulnerabilities. This investment creates attachment. Your base becomes more than shelter. It becomes home, the place you've invested hundreds of hours of effort, the physical manifestation of your survival success. Losing a base to zombie horde or fire or simple mistake carries genuine emotional weight disproportionate to mere gameplay setback. You've lost not just strategic position, but something that felt meaningful, evidence that even in game spaces, humans create attachment to places we've shaped through effort. The absence of rescue also transforms social dynamics in multiplayer contexts. When evacuation was possible, other survivors represented competition for limited evacuation slots. Fewer people means better chances of getting on the rescue vehicles. But once evacuation is recognized as impossible, other survivors become potentially valuable allies. People who can share labor and defense, create community in abandonment, provide social contact in isolation. Multiplayer servers see the emergence of communities that mirror historical settlement patterns. Groups form around shared bases, dividing labor according to skill and preference. Some focus on farming, others on scavenging, others on defense and zombie clearance. Trade emerges spontaneously, players exchanging surplus resources for items they lack. Social norms develop organically, rules about property and behavior that communities enforce through consensus rather than law. But multiplayer also reveals humanity's less noble aspects. Player versus player conflict emerges around resources, territory, personality clashes. Bandits develop, players who raid rather than produce, stealing from others' bases, killing for supplies. Trust becomes currency more valuable than ammunition. Knowing which players honor agreements and which betray allies, which communities welcome newcomers, and which shoot strangers on sight. These social dynamics aren't explicitly programmed, but emerge from the game's systems and the absence of external authority. With no police, no courts, no official structures to mediate disputes, communities develop their own governance or descend into violent anarchy. The most successful servers create internal social structures, leaders who coordinate activity, councils that resolve disputes, militias that defend against bandits and zombies, economies where labor and goods are exchanged through informal systems. The psychological acceptance that rescue isn't coming brings philosophical shifts beyond practical ones. When external salvation remains possible, you can maintain identity as temporarily inconvenienced rather than permanently changed. But accepting permanent status as survivor in the apocalypse requires accepting identity change. You're no longer whoever you were before, waiting to resume that life. You're this person now, living this existence, and pre-outbreak life isn't coming back. This mirrors real psychological transitions during extended hardship. Prisoners of war, shipwreck survivors, people trapped by disasters. They report similar psychological shifts, moments when they stop thinking, I'm temporarily away from my real life, and start thinking, this is my life now. That acceptance can be devastating or liberating depending on temperament. Some people never make the shift, maintain denial until death. Others embrace it, quickly pivoting to new reality with remarkable adaptability. Project Zomboid encourages this acceptance through its mechanical realism. You can't sprint indefinitely. Exhaustion forces rest. You can't carry unlimited items. Weight restrictions force prioritization. You can't ignore injury or illness. Wounds fester without treatment. Infections spread. The game insists you engage with physical reality rather than power fantasizing through it. And this insistence creates psychological parallels to actual survival situations where physical limits determine outcomes. The skill system reinforces long-term thinking. Skills improve slowly through practice. You become better carpenter by building repeatedly, better farmer by tending crops across multiple seasons, better fighter through combat experience. Early game sees characters as barely competent generalists, struggling with every task. But characters who survive months develop genuine expertise, masters of specific skills, capable and efficient in ways new characters can't approach. This creates remarkable attachment to long-surviving characters. They represent not just time invested, but skill accumulated, proof of learning and adaptation. Losing a character with level 5 carpentry and level 4 farming feels more devastating than losing a new character, because you're losing capability, competence, earned through patient effort. The permadeath system makes this loss permanent. You can't reload a save, can't undo mistakes. When your character dies, all that accumulated expertise dies with them. Some players report grief when long-running characters die, genuine emotional pain at losing digital personas they'd invested dozens or hundreds of hours developing. This seems absurd from outside. It's just a game, just pixels and code, just entertainment. But from inside the experience, the character represents something meaningful, proof that long-term survival is possible, evidence of your capability and planning, companion in isolation who shared the journey. The absence of rescue creates space for these deep investments. If evacuation was coming, characters would be temporary, placeholders, until official salvation arrived. But knowing survival depends entirely on personal capability makes character development crucial. Transforms skill progression from optional optimization into necessary survival strategy. You're not leveling up for fun or competitive advantage. You're learning skills that determine whether you live or die, that separate survivors from corpses. Environmental mastery becomes another long-term survival marker. New players don't know where supplies spawn, which buildings are dangerous, what strategies work, but experienced players develop deep knowledge. They know the layout of every town, can navigate in the dark, recognize buildings from silhouettes, understand zombie behavior patterns instinctively. This knowledge accumulates gradually, earned through exploration and mistakes, creating genuine expertise that new players lack. The map becomes mental landscape rather than abstract representation. You know shortcuts through Muldra, dangerous zones in West Point, good farming locations in the countryside. The towns transform from generic, zombie-infested areas into known territories with specific characteristics and strategic value. This knowledge investment makes Knox Country feel like a real place you inhabit, rather than a game level you temporarily visit. Seasonal adaptation demonstrates long-term survival capability most clearly. Summer allows mistakes. Temperatures are forgiving. Food grows readily. Zombies slow in heat. But winter demands preparation, punishes errors, separates survivors who planned from those who didn't. Making it through winter proves competence, demonstrates you understand the systems well enough to anticipate and counter seasonal threats. Multi-season survivors develop rhythms matching agricultural societies. Spring means planting, summer means building and expansion, autumn means harvest and preparation, winter means conservation and caution. This cycle feels meaningful despite being entirely optional from game perspective. You could survive purely through scavenging, never farming or preparing systematically, but players who embrace seasonal rhythms report deeper satisfaction, sense of living in the world rather than merely surviving day to day. The absence of rescue ultimately creates space for agency and meaning-making that rescue's presence would eliminate. If buses were coming, survival would be about waiting, enduring, until external salvation arrived. But knowing no rescue comes transforms survival into active project, purposeful existence, where your decisions and capabilities determine outcomes. You're not waiting for others to save you. You're saving yourself, day by day, through effort and planning and skill. This self-reliance brings peculiar satisfaction. Modern life involves extensive dependence on employers, governments, infrastructure, systems beyond individual control. Project Zomboid offers fantasy of complete autonomy, situation where you depend only on yourself, where your survival reflects your capability without mediation. It's fantasy because real survival would be horrific, but as safe digital experience, it provides psychological reward that dependency-saturated modern life rarely offers. The people who survived the Knox exclusion zone's first months in the game's fiction weren't special or heroic. They were simply people who accepted reality faster than others, who pivoted from waiting to acting while opportunity remained, who understood that survival required self-reliance because help would never arrive. Their stories, told through environmental details and accumulated skills and established bases, demonstrate that humans can adapt to extraordinary circumstances when we must, can create meaning and purpose even in situations that seem meaningless and purposeless, can survive without rescue when we accept that survival depends entirely on ourselves. The military withdrawal. Abandoned by authority. The Knox exclusion zone was established and maintained by military force, armed personnel, operating under orders to contain the infection at any cost. But the military's relationship to the zone shifted dramatically over 10 days, transforming from active containment operation to holding action to outright abandonment, leaving civilian populations trapped within borders that soldiers no longer guarded. Understanding this progression requires examining the military's institutional position during the Knox event. The armed forces were ordered to contain an infection they didn't understand, using protocols designed for conventional emergencies applied to unprecedented catastrophe. Soldiers trained for combat found themselves manning checkpoints against desperate civilians, shooting American citizens attempting to flee, maintaining perimeters against threats from inside rather than outside. The initial military response showed institutional competence. Forces mobilized rapidly, established checkpoints within hours, created substantial infrastructure almost overnight. This demonstrated organizational capability, ability to deploy personnel and equipment at scale. July 6th saw the perimeter established. July 7th saw it reinforced. The speed and coordination suggested serious planning, likely based on existing contingency protocols for biological containment or urban disaster. But competence in deployment doesn't equal competence in sustaining operations. The military could establish the exclusion zone, but struggled to maintain it against evolving conditions. Zombies didn't behave like any enemy soldiers trained to fight. They didn't retreat when fired upon, didn't respond to deterrence, didn't tire or break formation. Traditional infantry tactics proved ineffective against enemies that absorbed bullets and kept advancing, that felt no fear and required headshots for permanent neutralization. Ammunition consumption became an immediate problem. Military forces expended enormous quantities killing zombies, far more than combat against human adversaries would require. Supply lines from outside the zone struggled to keep pace with demand. Radio communications from July 9th and 10th include references to ammunition concerns, requests for resupply, warnings about conservation. These logistical strains suggested the operation was unsustainable from early days. Casualties mounted steadily. Soldiers became infected through bites and scratches during close combat, through careless moments when fatigue degraded vigilance. Each soldier lost reduced defensive capability, required others to fill gaps, increased pressure on remaining personnel. The July 12th media interviews with survivors released from Fort Knox mention military casualties specifically, suggesting numbers significant enough to warrant public discussion. Psychological strain affected the force as much as physical casualties. Soldiers were shooting American civilians attempting to cross checkpoints, following orders that violated every instinct about protecting citizens. They were abandoning people, clearly needing help, maintaining borders while screams came from inside the zone, doing nothing while those they were supposedly protecting died horribly. This created moral injury, psychological damage from actions that contradicted values and identity. The airborne strain emergence on July 15th broke the military's operational capacity completely. When 95% of forces inside the zone fell sick simultaneously, the containment operation collapsed instantly. Checkpoints went unmanned as soldiers either died or fled. Command structures dissolved as officers succumbed to infection. Equipment was abandoned, positions left undefended, the careful organization of days prior evaporating in hours. The July 15th overnight battles at the Louisville border camp marked the containment effort's effective end. Military forces fought desperately but unsuccessfully to prevent zombie hordes overwhelming their positions. The camp was breached, thousands of infected pouring through gaps in defenses, spreading into Louisville proper. This made the exclusion zone meaningless. If zombies could exit freely, if infection was already loose in Louisville, what purpose did the perimeter serve? The answer, apparently, was none. Military forces began withdrawing north on July 15th and 16th, pulling back from forward positions, consolidating at more defensible locations, and ultimately evacuating completely from the exclusion zone. The bridge demolitions on July 16th served dual purposes: preventing zombie hordes from crossing into the broader Midwest and preventing zombie hordes from reaching the evacuating military forces as they retreated north. This strategic withdrawal was sensible from military perspective. Forces were depleted, supplies low, mission objectives impossible to achieve. Staying meant dying pointlessly, while abandoning positions meant surviving to potentially fight another day. But the withdrawal also meant abandoning thousands of civilian survivors trapped within the zone, people who had relied on military presence for protection, who had believed soldiers would maintain positions and eventually facilitate evacuation. The physical evidence of military withdrawal appears throughout Knox County. Checkpoints stand empty, gates opened or breached, barriers pushed aside. Guard towers contain no guards. Equipment left behind suggesting hasty departure. Radios, ammunition, personal gear. The Louisville border camp shows signs of panic evacuation. Tents collapsed, vehicles abandoned with keys still in ignition, supply areas left unsecured with valuable equipment scattered. Fort Knox presents the most mysterious abandonment scenario. According to in-game lore, the famous military installation where Knox County got its name was evacuated completely. Prisoners held in cells released deliberately before military departure. Why release potentially infected detainees before evacuating? The decision makes no military or medical sense unless someone was trying to absolve guilt by not leaving people locked in cells to die, or unless chaos was so complete that careful protocols couldn't be followed. The fort today stands empty but intact, its buildings and infrastructure largely undamaged. This suggests organized rather than panicked evacuation, deliberate withdrawal following procedure rather than desperate flight. Military vehicles that were operational were likely driven north during evacuation, while damaged or fuel-less vehicles were abandoned. Supplies that could be carried were taken, but heavy equipment and stockpiled materials remain, too much to move given available transport. Individual military gear scattered throughout the zone tells personal stories of the withdrawal. Helmets left on checkpoint sandbags. Rifles dropped in the midst of defensive positions. Military radios still set to command frequencies, waiting for transmissions that stopped days ago. These items represent individual soldiers making decisions about what to carry during evacuation, choosing personal survival over maintaining full kit, prioritizing speed and weight reduction over equipment preservation. Some soldiers never made the evacuation. Zombies wearing military uniforms shamble through Knox County. Some still carrying weapons, some showing injuries suggesting they died fighting. Whether these were soldiers who became infected during the withdrawal or soldiers who chose to stay and fight independently can't be determined. The result is identical. Military personnel who became victims of the catastrophe they were ordered to contain. Radio communications from the withdrawal period reveal institutional breakdown. Messages become fragmented, lacking proper protocol, suggesting command structure collapse. Some transmissions are pleas for assistance from units cut off and surrounded. Others are evacuation orders without coordination details. Commands to withdraw without specified routes or destinations. The final military transmissions devolve into personal messages, individuals using equipment to contact loved ones rather than coordinate operations. The psychology of abandonment by authority creates specific trauma for survivors. These were people who believed in institutional protection, who trusted that military presence meant safety, who made decisions based on assumption that soldiers would maintain positions and provide eventual evacuation. The withdrawal shattered these beliefs, demonstrated that institutions prioritize self-preservation over public service when stakes become extreme, that authority figures abandon responsibilities when maintaining them becomes too costly. For players, empty military installations present complex emotional responses. On one hand, these locations contain valuable loot, weapons, ammunition, military vehicles, supplies that aid survival, but accessing them requires confronting the evidence of abandonment, requires processing the fact that these resources exist precisely because soldiers fled rather than protecting civilians. Using military equipment feels like grave robbing in a sense, taking from dead institutions what they should have provided but didn't. The symbolism of empty guard towers particularly resonates. These elevated positions were meant to provide visibility and security, protected vantage points from which soldiers could observe and respond to threats. But empty towers demonstrate that elevation means nothing without commitment to duty, that structures built for protection become mere environmental features when those charged with using them abandon positions. Players can climb these towers and gain the same visibility advantages soldiers had, but without institutional backing, without radio communications coordinating response, without support that made those positions meaningful. Some multiplayer servers see players reoccupying military positions, establishing bases and checkpoints and forts, using abandoned infrastructure for their own survival and community protection. This represents poetic justice in a sense, civilians using military resources for purposes the military was supposed to serve but failed to. The bases change ownership but maintain function, though downscaled from large-scale containment operation to small group survival strategy. The military withdrawal represents more than tactical retreat. It represents the failure of organized institutional response to catastrophic disaster, the revelation that government capabilities are limited even in wealthy developed nations, that when situations exceed certain thresholds of severity, institutions preserve themselves rather than serving populations. This is uncomfortable truth that emergency planners acknowledge in private but rarely admit publicly. Past certain catastrophe scales, you're on your own. Official assistance won't arrive. Survival depends on personal capability and community cooperation rather than government rescue. Project Zomboid makes this truth explicit, builds gameplay systems around it, forces players to internalize that no help is coming and adapt accordingly. The empty military installations throughout Knox County serve as constant reminders of this reality. Monuments to promises broken not through malice but through institutional incapacity. Evidence that even armies and governments can fail when confronted with unprecedented circumstances. That authority is less reliable than we'd prefer to believe. The soldiers who evacuated made rational decisions given information and resources available. Staying meant certain death. Leaving meant possibility of survival. But rationality doesn't change impact on those left behind, doesn't make abandonment less devastating for people who trusted in protection that evaporated. The empty checkpoints and abandoned forts testify to the gap between what institutions promise and what they deliver when tested by genuine catastrophe. Between official capability during normal hash, the long winter archive. No one was evacuated from this area. Project Zomboid. Welcome back to the Long Winter Archive. Tonight, we open another file from the collection. A record of promises broken, of boundaries drawn and abandoned, of people left behind when those who swore protection chose instead to flee. This is the story of the Knox County Exclusion Zone, a geographic prison where no evacuation ever came, where help never arrived, where the fences erected for containment became walls of a tomb. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow the tale of abandonment and self-reliance to wash over you like the realization that you were always on your own, that rescue was always a comforting fiction, that survival belongs only to those who accept this truth. The Exclusion Zone, Geography of Abandonment, The Knox Country exclusion zone exists as both physical reality and psychological construct, a defined territory marked by fences and checkpoints, but more fundamentally, a space of abandonment, a place the outside world decided to forget while pretending the decision was about protection rather than expedience. The borders were established with remarkable speed on July 6, 1993, just 2 days after the first confirmed cases of what would become known as the Knox event. At 600 hours Eastern Daylight Time, United States military forces began blocking roads in and around the area of northern Kentucky, nicknamed Knox Country. No official reason was given initially. Areas within the blockade included Muldrow, West Point, Brandenburg, and Fort Knox itself, the famous military installation that gave the county its original name, though locals had already corrupted it to country in their regional dialect. By 1100 hours that same morning, military personnel had erected substantial fencing and established permanent checkpoints within what was now officially designated the Knox Exclusion Zone. The speed of this operation suggests pre-planning. Infrastructure moved into position before the public was aware anything required such drastic containment measures. Entrance and exit were forbidden absolutely. Reports emerged immediately of residents being turned away at gunpoint, families separated when some members happened to be outside the perimeter for work or travel, when the zone snapped closed like a trap. The primary boundary camp was established south of Louisville, positioned to control access between Kentucky's largest city and the infected smaller towns to the south. This Louisville border camp would become the largest and most heavily fortified checkpoint, a sprawling military installation with barracks tents, medical facilities, communications equipment, armories, and refugee processing areas. It represented the public face of the containment operation, the place where civilians gathered hoping for information, for evacuation, for rescue that would never materialize. The physical barriers varied in sophistication across the zone's perimeter. Major highways received the most extensive treatment. Chain link fencing topped with razor wire, concrete barriers forming vehicle chicanes, guard towers providing elevated observation positions, and multiple layers of checkpoints, ensuring nothing moved in or out without military approval. Secondary roads received simpler barriers, sawhorses and military vehicles blocking passage, hastily erected fencing, armed guards manning positions day and night. Even minor country roads and forest paths saw some level of blocking attempt, though the sheer length of the perimeter made complete sealing impossible. The Ohio River formed a natural northern boundary, its wide waters providing a barrier that seemed more absolute than fences. But rivers can be crossed by boat, by swimming, potentially by wading at shallow points during low water. The military understood this vulnerability and positioned forces along the riverbanks, monitoring for escape attempts or, increasingly, for zombies shambling into the current. River crossings became particularly crucial choke points, and on July 16th, in an act of desperate finality, the United States military demolished every bridge over the Ohio River within and adjacent to the Knox Exclusion Zone. The bridge demolitions killed hundreds of civilians attempting to flee north. Cars plummeted into the cold water as roadway collapsed beneath them. Families died together, crushed under falling concrete, or drowned in the strong current when they survived the initial collapse. The explosions were carefully timed for maximum structural destruction. Charges placed by combat engineers who followed their orders, despite knowing those orders meant murdering terrified refugees whose only crime was trying to escape a quarantine zone that had already failed its containment purpose. Today, players exploring Knox Country can visit these ruined bridge approaches. The twisted girders reach across the Ohio River like accusing fingers, frozen mid-span, testimony to the moment hope died and the exclusion zone transformed from quarantine into tomb. The western bank stands abandoned. No military presence remains, No checkpoints guard these ruined passages. The zombies that shamble near the wreckage wear a mix of civilian clothing and military uniforms, impossible to distinguish at distance, all equally dead, all equally doomed. The perimeter itself tells a story of escalating desperation. In those first days, checkpoints appeared almost orderly. Military precision applied to containment. Soldiers in hazmat suits moving with purpose. Fencing erected in neat geometric patterns. Radio broadcasts from July 6 and 7 describe residents being turned away at checkpoints, passive language suggesting nonviolent enforcement. But environmental evidence reveals a different truth. Bullet impacts scar the checkpoint structures, bloodstains concrete barriers. Abandoned personal belongings scatter near fence lines. Suitcases, children's toys, family photos, evidence of people who approached hoping for passage and instead received violence. The Louisville border camp preserves this history most completely. The checkpoint's main sections remain largely intact in the game world, though overrun with thousands of zombies drawn to this former concentration of human activity. The Army checkpoint proper sits directly on the border, a complex of multiple sections serving different functions. Offices on the southwest side contain military radios, computers, quarantine facilities where infected or potentially infected individuals were supposedly held for observation. The medical center on the southeast side provided first aid supplies and treatment capabilities, though whether this medical care extended to civilians or only military personnel remains unclear. Barracks tents on multiple sides housed the soldiers manning this operation, containing military clothing and equipment, bunks where young National Guard members slept between shifts, personal effects abandoned when the evacuation order came. North of the Army checkpoint lies the refugee camp, a sprawling tent city where civilians gathered after being turned away from passage, hoping against evidence that someone would eventually let them through, that evacuation buses would arrive, that this nightmare would end through official action rather than death. The refugee camp's layout speaks to the chaos and desperation of those days. Tents cluster without organization, erected wherever space existed, spreading organically as more people arrived with nowhere else to go. No sanitation infrastructure was established. The military provided no support for these refugees, viewing them as problems rather than people deserving care. Disease would have been rampant even without the Knox infection, dysentery and cholera spreading through inadequate water and sewage systems. When the airborne strain emerged and 95% of camp survivors fell ill simultaneously, the refugee camp became an undead nightmare. Thousands of infected turning in close proximity, overwhelming the military positions and breaching the very fences that had kept these people trapped. Other checkpoints dot the exclusion zone perimeter at strategic intervals. The Ernest Cooper Road checkpoint marks the point where the official road ends and Smuggler's Road begins, a naming coincidence that proved grimly appropriate as desperate survivors sought unofficial routes out of the zone. Further east along the border sits a military post, where two produce warehouses were commandeered, one repurposed as mechanic garage, cafeteria, and armory, while the other remained stocked with produce that rotted while people starved. These smaller checkpoints received less attention in the evacuation, some abandoned entirely when forces consolidated at larger positions, leaving behind equipment and supplies that now lured dangerous scavenging runs. The exclusion zone boundary exists in current gameplay as partially breached fencing, gaps created either by zombie hordes overwhelming positions or by the military creating exit routes during their withdrawal. Players can access the Louisville border camp from the south through the train yard, following the fence line east, until finding a breach that permits entry on foot. The main checkpoint remains fenced and gated, requiring sledgehammers or welding equipment to access properly, but the breach exists, evidence that the cordon failed, that containment was always temporary, that borders drawn in fear collapse when tested by sufficient pressure. Watching over this abandoned perimeter are guard towers, elevated positions providing sight lines across the fence. These towers stand empty now, their mounted searchlights dark, their radio equipment silent, their observation logs ended mid-shift, when whoever was riding them either died or fled. Climbing these towers in the game provides excellent vantage points, but also exposure. The elevation that aids observation also eliminates concealment, making you visible to every zombie in visual range. It's a perfect metaphor for the military's position during the Knox event. Elevation provided the illusion of control while actually increasing vulnerability. Height creating exposure rather than safety. The psychological impact of these borders deserves careful consideration. For residents of Knox County, the exclusion zone boundaries represented imprisonment without trial, collective punishment for geographic misfortune. Families were separated. Those who happened to be outside the perimeter when it closed could not return. Those inside could not leave. Phone lines had been cut July 6th, preventing communication across the boundary, isolating trapped residents from reassurance or information. The fences served no protective function for those inside. They existed solely to prevent spread, to sacrifice the trapped population for the theoretical safety of those beyond. This created a unique psychological situation. Typically, quarantine implies temporary separation, with the promise of eventual reintegration once danger passes. But the Knox exclusion zone's design made clear from the beginning that no reintegration was planned. The barriers were too substantial, too permanent, built for indefinite maintenance rather than eventual removal. The military positioned weapons outward from the zone, preventing exit rather than entry. Everything about the perimeter's design communicated a simple message. You are trapped here. You will die here. We are ensuring you cannot leave. Some residents understood this immediately. Evidence in abandoned homes shows rapid fortification. Furniture piled against doors, windows boarded from inside, stockpiles of food and water suggesting occupants knew help would not arrive and prepared for extended siege. Others maintained hope longer, their homes showing evidence of bags packed for evacuation, family photos carefully selected to bring when rescue came, calendars with dates marked evac day, in optimistic handwriting that later entries crossed out with increasing desperation. The borders also created artificial scarcity. Knox County's economy depended on goods flowing in from Louisville and other external sources. Grocery stores received daily deliveries from regional distribution centers. Gas stations got fuel from refineries outside the zone. Medical facilities ordered supplies from pharmaceutical companies based in distant cities. When the exclusion zone closed, these supply chains severed instantly. What existed inside the zone was all that would ever exist. A finite quantity of food, medicine, fuel, gradually depleting as days passed with no resupply. This drove human behavior in predictable directions. Looting began immediately, stores and warehouses stripped of valuable supplies by those acting on survival instinct. Violence erupted over resources. The July 13th riots at the Louisville border camp began when civilian groups clashed with military over food distribution, each side believing the other was hoarding supplies, while people starved. These riots attracted zombies, drew the infected to the largest concentration of living humans, precipitating the breach that doomed the quarantine effort. The game world preserves evidence of these desperate days. Stores show signs of hasty looting, aisles ransacked, shelves stripped of the most desirable items, while less popular goods remain. Some buildings were barricaded by their owners attempting to prevent looting, boards nailed over windows, doors reinforced, signs warning away trespassers. These defensive efforts failed. when the owners died or fled, leaving fortified but abandoned structures that now require players to break through the same barriers erected in doomed hope. Walking the perimeter today induces specific melancholy. The fences still stand in many places, marking boundaries that no longer matter. No military guards these positions. No one prevents crossing. The borders exist only as environmental features, obstacles to navigation rather than enforcement, testimony to human effort that achieved nothing except prolonging suffering. Every checkpoint, every guard tower, every section of fence represents labor and resources invested in a doomed effort. Good money and good people thrown at a problem that had no solution. And everywhere, the zombies. Former soldiers in combat gear and hazmat suits, National Guard members who 4 days before the outbreak were preparing to ship overseas but got redirected to guard their own homes. Civilians who approached checkpoints seeking help or evacuation and instead received bullets or abandonment. The infected cluster densely around former military positions, drawn originally by the sounds of combat and human presence, now wandering aimlessly through the spaces they destroyed, maintaining presence through sheer persistence, even as purpose has evaporated. The Knox County exclusion zone was meant to protect the world from infection. Instead, it became a geographic prison, a sacrifice zone, a place where thousands died because containment mattered more than rescue, where borders drawn in panic hardened into barriers that trapped rather than protected, where the promise of military assistance transformed into the reality of military abandonment. The fences remain as monuments to this failure, rusted testament that sometimes the worst disasters aren't caused by disease or disaster, but by human decisions, by the choice to draw lines and defend them rather than help those trapped inside. July 1993, the promise of evacuation in those early days of the Knox event. Evacuation was not just hoped for but promised, explicitly stated in official communications, offered as certainty by authorities who either believed they could deliver or chose comfortable lies over difficult truth. Understanding how these promises emerged, evolved, and ultimately revealed themselves as fiction requires examining the timeline in detail, watching hope erode day by day until even the pretense of rescue collapsed. July 9th, 1993, the day most players spawn into Knox County, the official beginning of the game's timeline, saw the first major public statement from General John McGrew, the United States Army officer overseeing containment measures within the Knox exclusion zone. McGrew's 1,100 hours press conference established the official narrative that would govern public understanding for the next week. He described the illness as flu-like, characterized by panic and confusion, symptoms that sounded manageable, explicable within normal medical frameworks. Crucially, McGrew stated that there was no evidence of fatalities within the exclusion zone. This was a lie. Players spawning into the game world on July 9th encounter zombies immediately. Shambling infected filling the streets of Muldraugh and West Point, proof that people had not just died but reanimated. The fatalities were extensive and ongoing. McGrew either didn't know the true situation inside the zone he supposedly controlled, or knew and chose deception over transparency. Either possibility suggests profound failure of the command structure, inability to gather accurate intelligence, or willingness to misrepresent reality to prevent panic. But embedded in McGrew's statement was an implicit promise. The military has this under control. The use of medical language, flu-like symptoms, panic, confusion, framed the outbreak as a health crisis requiring quarantine and treatment, rather than an existential catastrophe requiring evacuation and abandonment. The message was clear. Stay calm, shelter in place. Allow authorities to handle this. Everything will return to normal soon. July 10th brought the first scientific confirmation that the infection was widespread within the zone. Military personnel and scientists acknowledged the scope while attempting to maintain the fiction of control. Television and radio broadcasts provided updates designed to inform while preventing panic, a delicate balance that satisfied no one and helped nothing. The fact that these broadcasts reached people inside the zone at all was remarkable, given the communication infrastructure's degradation. But radios and televisions continued functioning as long as electrical power remained, providing windows into the official narrative that increasingly diverged from lived reality. The nature of the broadcast themselves implied evacuation as eventual outcome. Why else provide detailed survival instructions? Why explain food storage, water purification, defensive fortification, unless the underlying assumption was that people needed to survive until help arrived? The very structure of emergency communications contained embedded promises. Hold out, help is coming. Rescue will arrive if you can just survive a little longer. Television programming during this period included genuinely useful content. The Life and Living Channel broadcast cooking shows, carpentry tutorials, fishing instruction, skill-building content that players could watch to increase their characters' capabilities. These shows ran on schedule through mid-July, suggesting television networks were still operating somewhat normally, that broadcasters were showing up for work, that some semblance of regular programming continued even as the world ended. The fact that these shows existed at all communicated normalcy, implied that conditions would stabilize enough for newly acquired skills to have value beyond immediate survival. But interspersed with cooking shows and home improvement content were the news broadcasts, and here the narrative began fracturing. July 11th saw the World Health Organization ground all non-essential international flights after 1,800 hours Eastern Standard Time, a global response suggesting the infection had spread far beyond Knox County. If the situation was contained, why were flights worldwide being canceled? The cognitive dissonance between Knox event is local and controlled and international travel is suspended created confusion and fear that official statements could not address. July 12th brought the first visual evidence that penetrated the information cordon. A photograph leaked from West Point showing a blood-covered man with blood around his mouth, one arm raised, torn flesh hanging from the other, walking aimlessly down a street full of corpses. This single image did more damage to the official narrative than any number of radio reports. Here was undeniable proof that something unprecedented was occurring, that people weren't merely sick, but had become something else, that the government's careful language about illness and confusion was catastrophically inadequate. The photographs sparked riots in major American cities. New York, Miami, Los Angeles all experienced violent outbursts as public fear overcame social order. Peacekeeping forces were stationed nationwide, curfews implemented, martial law spreading like the infection itself. These responses revealed the truth authorities tried hiding. They were losing control. The situation was escalating beyond management. Containment had failed even as checkpoints were maintained. July 13th saw media interviews with survivors released from military captivity within the exclusion zone, people who had been held at Fort Knox or other facilities and then inexplicably let go. These survivors described the infected as hunting the living, spreading infection through bites, exhibiting behavior that couldn't be explained by any disease model. The careful medical framing collapsed as witnesses used words like monsters and dead walking, language that authorities refused to validate but couldn't effectively counter. And through all of this, the implicit promise remained: evacuation is coming. The military maintains presence, establishes camps, processes refugees. The Louisville border camp specifically was positioned as processing center, a location where civilians would be documented, screened for infection, and eventually transported out of the exclusion zone to safety. The existence of this infrastructure suggested a plan, implied that someone was organizing rescue even if immediate evacuation wasn't possible. July 14th brought General McGrew's next major statement, his attempt to restore the crumbling official narrative. He assured the nation that America is safe, while elaborating on Knox event details in ways that confirmed everyone's worst fears. McGrew acknowledged that infection spreads through direct fluid contact, through scratches, through what he delicately called un-American acts of violence, a euphemism for bites that fooled no one. The careful language revealed more than it concealed. Authorities knew what was happening, knew it was unprecedented and terrifying, and chose evasion over honesty. But McGrew maintained the promised structure. He didn't explicitly state evacuation was coming, but neither did he announce it wouldn't. The careful omission allowed hope to persist, let people inside the zone continue believing that if they just survived long enough, buses would arrive, helicopters would land, official rescue would materialize. This hope was worse than despair. It kept people in place. Rather than triggering independent escape attempts, kept them looking outward for salvation. Rather than focusing on self-reliance, kept them vulnerable and waiting while their window of opportunity closed. July 15th shattered whatever remained of the containment fiction. Overnight, intense battles near the Knox boundary camp failed to stop the tide of infected. These were skirmishes or isolated incidents, but sustained combat. Soldiers fighting desperately against overwhelming numbers. Positions being overrun despite superior firepower and defensive positions. Radio broadcasts described the military beginning to pull back north, abandoning forward positions, consolidating at more defensible locations. This was retreat language, acknowledgement that the mission had changed from containment to survival. The same day brought reports of localized successes by armed civilians aided by soldiers defying evacuation orders. This revealed cracks in military discipline, some soldiers choosing to stay and fight alongside trapped civilians rather than following orders to withdraw. These defiant soldiers represented the promise authorities had made and broken, individuals attempting to honor commitments their institution had abandoned. Their resistance was heroic and futile, buying hours or days for specific communities while the larger strategic position collapsed. And then came the announcement that ended all pretense. Individuals were falling sick with the Knox virus without being bitten, without any direct contact with the infected. The disease had gone airborne. Evacuation became impossible not just logistically but medically. Anyone leaving the zone potentially carried infection would spread it wherever they went. The exclusion zone's purpose transformed instantly from containment until cure to permanent isolation of infected population. Within hours, at least 95% of camp survivors and zone military personnel fell ill with this airborne strain. The Louisville border camp, that supposed processing center for eventual evacuation, became a mass dying ground. Thousands of people crammed together in close quarters, sharing air, breathing the same infected atmosphere, falling sick simultaneously in a cascade that overwhelmed any possible medical response. The camp descended into chaos, mobs attacking anyone showing symptoms, summary executions of the ill, desperate attempts to identify and isolate the infected that failed because nearly everyone was infected. The first carriers of the aerial strain died and turned on July 15th evening. Many were already inside Louisville or across the Ohio bridges, meaning the infection was now definitively beyond the exclusion zone, spreading into Kentucky's largest city and potentially beyond. The careful borders meant nothing against airborne transmission. The checkpoints guarded against any relevant threat, while the actual danger floated on wind currents across fences and rivers. July 16th brought the bridge demolitions, the moment when containment became imprisonment, when holding the line became ensuring everyone dies here. The military's logic was grimly rational. If the bridges were destroyed, the infected couldn't stream north across the Ohio River, couldn't flood into the broader Midwest. But this logic required accepting that everyone trapped south of those bridges would die, that the refugees fleeing across those spans as explosives detonated were acceptable casualties in service of containment. The promise of evacuation died with those refugees. Not just died, but was revealed as a lie that had persisted for 10 days, a fiction maintained through careful language and deceptive omission. No evacuation had ever been planned. The exclusion zone was always meant to be a sacrifice zone, its population expendable in service of protecting the larger American population. The checkpoints existed not to process people for rescue, but to ensure none escaped. The Louisville border camp was never a processing center, but a holding pen, keeping people concentrated and controllable until the airborne strain eliminated them en masse. General John McGrew's final broadcast came on July 17th, addressed specifically to those who had proven immune to the airborne Knox infection, the small percentage who didn't fall sick from atmospheric exposure but remained vulnerable to fluid contact, to bites and scratches. McGrew's message to these survivors was clear. You're on your own. Defend yourselves. Take extreme measures. Do whatever necessary to stay alive. He confirmed what survivors had already realized, that being immune meant being among the last humans left, that no organized rescue would come, that survival depended entirely on individual capability and luck. McGrew ended with a lie disguised as comfort. You have not been forgotten. But the bridges were demolished. The military was withdrawing. Radio broadcasts were ending. Every action contradicted McGrew's words, demonstrated that survivors had not merely been forgotten, but deliberately abandoned, written off as acceptable losses in a containment effort that had already failed. By July 18th, most radio and television broadcasts had ceased. NNR Radio sent its final transmission confirming global spread of the Knox infection, then went silent. The emergency broadcast system's automated warnings cycled through their loops a few more times before those too ended, leaving only static on frequencies where human voices used to explain and guide and promise. The promise of evacuation had always been a comfortable fiction, a story authorities told themselves and others to make unbearable decisions seem bearable. It allowed the drawing of borders that doomed thousands while pretending those borders served protective rather than sacrificial purposes. It justified checkpoints and fences and guards with shoot-to-kill orders by framing them as temporary measures until evacuation logistics could be arranged. It let officials sleep at night by maintaining the fantasy that they were saving lives rather than orchestrating mass death through neglect. For those trapped inside the Knox exclusion zone, the progressive revelation that no evacuation would come followed predictable psychological stages. Initial hope gave way to growing doubt. Doubt hardened into suspicion. Suspicion transformed into certainty. And certainty finally settled into acceptance or despair, depending on individual temperament. Some people never accepted it, died still waiting for buses that would never arrive, watching skies for helicopters that would never land. Others accepted quickly and pivoted to self-reliance, understanding that survival required abandoning hope in external rescue and embracing whatever capabilities they possessed. Project Zomboid's gameplay enforces this psychological progression. Early game might see players optimistically waiting near roads, hoping for military convoys bringing supplies or rescue. But as days pass and no help arrives, As zombies accumulate and resources deplete, waiting reveals itself as death sentence. Survival requires action, requires accepting that you are alone, that no evacuation will come, that the only help available is what you create yourself through scavenging, fortification, and careful resource management. The promise of evacuation, then, was the Knox event's cruelest aspect, more damaging than the infection itself because it delayed adaptation, prevented people from taking independent survival measures, kept them passive and vulnerable when activity and aggression might have saved them. It was a kindness that killed, a mercy that murdered, a comfort that doomed everyone who believed it. The infrastructure of false hope throughout Knox County, physical evidence of evacuation planning creates a landscape of broken promises, infrastructure built for purposes it would never serve, systems designed for futures that never arrived. This architecture of false hope tells stories about institutional failure, about the gap between planning and execution, about how organizations create elaborate structures for scenarios they don't actually expect to handle. Emergency services buildings stand as the most visible monuments to this failed preparation. Fire stations in Muldraugh, Rosewood, West Point, and other towns were designed as response hubs, equipped and staffed to handle local emergencies. Their apparatus bays contain fire trucks with full fuel tanks and functioning equipment. Tool rooms hold axes, Halligan bars, pike poles, implements useful for forcible entry and rescue operations. Living quarters suggest 24-hour staffing, firefighters sleeping at the station to ensure immediate response capability. But when the Knox event occurred, these capabilities proved irrelevant. Fire stations couldn't respond to an outbreak. Fire trucks couldn't transport infected people to medical care. Firefighters trained in search and rescue found those skills useless when the people they found were already dead or transformed into something that attacked rescuers. The infrastructure existed, fully functional, but its purpose had been rendered obsolete by circumstances its designers never imagined. Players looting fire stations discover this contradiction viscerally. The buildings contain genuinely useful equipment. Axes make excellent melee weapons. Fire trucks can transport goods and serve as mobile storage. Protective gear provides armor value against bites and scratches. But this utility is incidental. Repurposing, designed for other purposes. The fire stations weren't meant to serve apocalypse survivors. They were meant to serve communities that no longer exist, responding to emergencies that no longer matter. Police stations present similar contradictions. These buildings were positioned as command centers for emergency coordination, with jail cells for detaining people, evidence rooms for storing materials, armories with weapons and ammunition, radio equipment for communication. The infrastructure suggests preparedness, implies that law enforcement planned for civil disturbances and crisis scenarios, but the planning proved inadequate to reality. The Muldraugh police station sits at the town's center, a squat brick building projecting authority and permanence. Its cells remain empty or occupied by zombies that might have been prisoners or might have been officers, impossible to tell after reanimation. The evidence room still contains materials from investigations that will never proceed to trial. The armory holds weapons that defenders either deployed ineffectively or never accessed before being overwhelmed. Everything points to hasty abandonment, to the moment order realized it could not be maintained, and those charged with maintaining it fled or died. What's most striking is what's absent: no signs of evacuation coordination. Police stations would logically serve as gathering points for organized civilian rescue, places where authorities would direct people to assemble for transport to safety. But the stations show no evidence of this use. No crowd control barriers mark assembly areas. No supplies suggest preparation for housing or feeding large groups. The stations were designed for ordinary policing, not apocalyptic rescue. And when the extraordinary arrived, ordinary infrastructure failed. Hospitals represent perhaps the cruelest architectural irony. These massive facilities were built specifically to save lives, equipped with emergency rooms, surgical suites, intensive care units, pharmaceutical storage, all the technology and expertise modern medicine could provide. But the Knox infection had no treatment, no cure, no medical intervention that could prevent death and reanimation. Hospitals became death traps, concentrations of infected and dying that overwhelmed staff and spread infection faster than isolation could prevent. The environmental storytelling in Knox County's hospitals reveals this progression. Emergency rooms contain gurneys still occupied by corpses, patients who arrived seeking treatment and received only a bed to die in. Supply rooms are picked clean of useful medications, evidence that medical staff tried to treat symptoms even when cure was impossible. Some rooms show signs of attempted fortification. Furniture pushed against doors, desperate barricades erected by those who realized their workplace had become a tomb and tried futilely to secure spaces within it. The Louisville General Hospital stands as the largest medical facility, a multi-story complex that should have been able to handle any crisis. But its size became liability rather than asset. Too much space to secure, too many entry points to defend, too many people seeking help who brought infection rather than receiving treatment. Hospitals were designed for healing, but healing requires patients who can recover. When patients invariably died and rose again, hospitals became zombie factories, producing more infected with industrial efficiency. Evacuation routes, marked on in-game maps, provide another layer of false hope. Highway signs directing traffic flow, emergency route markers suggesting designated paths for leaving affected areas. All this infrastructure implies planning, suggests that authorities had identified how people would be moved to safety. But following these marked routes leads nowhere productive. The roads end at checkpoints that were never opened for evacuation, at bridge approaches leading to demolished spans, at borders designed to trap rather than facilitate passage. The cognitive dissonance is sharp. Why mark evacuation routes if no evacuation was planned? Either authorities genuinely believed they would evacuate civilians and created infrastructure accordingly, or they created false infrastructure to maintain the illusion of evacuation planning while intending no such thing. Either possibility suggests institutional dysfunction, inability to execute planned operations, or willingness to deceive the public about intentions. Neither interpretation provides comfort. Military installations scattered throughout the zone reveal similar planning/execution gaps. Fort Knox, the famous military base and gold depository, should have been the exclusion zone's most secure location. Military personnel, defensive infrastructure, weapons and ammunition stockpiles, secure perimeters, everything needed to establish safe zones and protect civilians. But the fort was abandoned, its personnel evacuated or dead, its security measures useless against an enemy that didn't fear bullets and couldn't be deterred by walls. The mystery surrounding Fort Knox's abandonment adds to the architectural irony. According to lore, people were quarantined there initially, cells filled with suspected infected, awaiting medical evaluation. Then, one day, all the cells were unlocked and the military was gone. Prisoners and guards alike vanished or transformed, the fort standing empty, as if someone flipped a switch and deactivated the entire facility simultaneously. This suggests either catastrophic institutional collapse or deliberate evacuation of military personnel, while civilian detainees were left behind. Abandonment so complete and sudden that it appears almost supernatural. The secret government facility south of Rosewood presents the darkest architectural mystery. This unmarked building deep in the woods doesn't appear on official maps, features no signage indicating its purpose, and contains a mix of medical and research equipment suggesting classified operations. The Underground Bunker Edition in Build 42 expanded this location scope, adding laboratories, holding cells, and evidence of testing that might relate to the Knox infection's origins. If this facility was involved in the outbreak, whether through research that created the infection, through containment failure of samples, or through weaponization efforts gone wrong, its existence represents planning of a different kind. Not evacuation planning, but contingency planning, preparation for scenarios involving biological weapons or emerging diseases. The facility's remote location, security infrastructure, and specialized equipment suggest serious preparedness for catastrophic biological events. But if preparation existed, it failed to prevent or contain the Knox event, failed so completely that the facility itself was evacuated in apparent panic. Documents scattered, equipment abandoned, nothing locked down or secured properly. Stockpiled emergency supplies throughout the zone represent another form of false hope infrastructure. Warehouses contain food, water, medical supplies, quantities suggesting preparation for feeding and treating large populations during extended emergencies. Government buildings have basements stocked with rations and equipment. Some stores show evidence of having received official emergency supplies, pallets of military MREs, and water bottles positioned for distribution that never occurred. These stockpiles serve their purpose ironically, not for organized distribution to needy civilians, but as loot for survivors scavenging in the apocalypse's aftermath. The supplies were meant for official allocation through channels of authority and order. Instead, they became prizes for whoever could fight through zombies and carry away what they needed: the infrastructure of organized distribution, the plans for rationing, the systems for equitable allocation, the authority structures meant to prevent hoarding. All collapsed, leaving only the raw materials for anyone bold or desperate enough to take them. Communication equipment represents perhaps the most poignant false hope infrastructure. Radio towers, telecommunication centers, emergency broadcast facilities, all designed to keep information flowing during crises, to coordinate responses, to keep citizens informed and connected. The Knox event saw extensive use of these systems essentially, broadcasts providing updates and instructions, officials making statements, emergency alerts going out through every available channel. But communication infrastructure requires people to operate it, and those people died or fled. The broadcast stopped not because equipment failed, but because broadcasters abandoned their posts, because the information they were supposed to communicate became too horrible to share, because coordinating rescue made no sense when no rescue existed to coordinate. Radio towers still stand, capable of transmission if anyone had messages to send. Telecommunication centers have functioning equipment waiting for operators who will never return. Emergency broadcast systems cycle through automated messages until power failures silence them, their recorded warnings growing increasingly irrelevant as the scenarios they describe recede into the past. In multiplayer servers, players sometimes establish radio stations, broadcasting to other survivors, maintaining human communication despite the apocalypse. This player-created infrastructure partially fulfills the purpose of official systems, though on vastly smaller scale and without institutional backing. The fact that players do this speaks to communication's importance, to human need for connection and information sharing that persists even when survival is uncertain. The infrastructure of false hope creates a specific emotional landscape in Knox Country. Everywhere you go, you encounter buildings and systems designed for purposes they never served, preparation that proved inadequate, planning that failed execution. It's a landscape of institutional failure, where the gap between what authorities prepared for and what actually happened is measured in thousands of lives. The buildings stand as monuments to this failure, silent testimony that good intentions and careful planning mean nothing when confronted with circumstances beyond imagined parameters. Walking through an abandoned fire station, looting a police armory, scavenging medical supplies from a hospital, these actions carry weight beyond simple resource gathering. They represent inheriting the ruins of civilization's attempts to prepare for disaster, taking what was meant for collective protection and using it for individual survival, salvaging value from failed systems. The infrastructure was meant to save people through coordinated official action. Instead, it serves people through uncoordinated individual sex.